boxes made of ticky-tacky little boxes, little boxes, little boxes all the same. There's a green one and a pink one and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky and they all look just the same.
Okay, hopefully, since this is a room of under 45s, not too many people remember that song, which came out in the 60s to talk about how everybody fits in the same mold. Everybody goes to university, everybody lives in these ticky-tacky houses and lives in the same box. And it's usually a song that's used to talk about how people must think out of the box and come and bring change and think different ways of addressing the problems or the challenges and even the opportunities that we have in front of us. And today, I have, I think, a difficult task. I'm sitting in front of about 150 to 200 of the most out-of-the-box thinkers that we have on the African continent. And I'm going to try and convince you that actually what I want us to do is start thinking inside the box. What I want you to do is think about how, using policy, law, and regulation in an African context, we should start to think inside the box to encourage prosperity and to better take advantage of the opportunities that we have. We've agreed that there are many opportunities across the continent, and this is a continent where we want to be and where we want to invest, where we want to grow, where markets are booming, and that thinking inside of the box is the way to go. The other difficult thing is to make regulation fun. I love this stuff, huh? And nobody seems to understand why the regulatory sector can be interesting. So 2 things today, to try and make you understand the importance of regulation in encouraging African prosperity, but also, most importantly, thinking inside the box. So if you go back to the basis of regulation, there's a theory, tragedy of the commons. There's not enough resources for everybody, and everybody is inherently self-interested. Everybody will always look out for themselves first. And this theory is usually used in the agricultural sector, where you say if you put cows out to graze, and you have common land, every farmer will put more cows and more cows until the land is overgrazed, and they'll all work in their own interest and not in the interest of the common good, which is the land. And what I'm here today to explain is how we need to make sure that we don't have a tragedy of the commons in terms of African sector resources. We talked about all the industries that are going to be growing, but rather that we find ways to address this potential tragedy. We have lots of opportunities across the continent. And what I'm saying is we need to put boxes around. We need to put boxes around some of these opportunities, and I know it's an unpopular notion, particularly for private sector who wants to go and exploit all opportunities, but we need to put some sort of boxes that are rules, processes, regulations, laws, so that we can better exploit these opportunities for the public benefit, not in a self-interested manner. And I think across the continent, it's pretty much understood. Most countries have good laws, or they have laws, regulations in place, but they're not necessarily good because they're putting in place the wrong size box. So we're taking these boxes. I've gone to countries where I open the legislation, and literally you might as well see that the application should be deposited in London for a license. They've almost not deleted that part of the application. So you have these cut-and-paste policymakers, cut-and-paste lawyers who are taking good models, but not necessarily African models, and applying them in an African context. So what happens is we have the wrong size box, and we have all these other ideas and opportunities that don't fit inside those boxes. So what we need to do is make sure we have the right size boxes, the right size regulations, the right size policies, so that we're actually doing things that address our problems and opportunities. One sector, and this is a sector that I come from, which is the ICT sector, that is often said to be a very well-regulated one. And I think if you compare across the continent, you do have well-regulated ICT sectors. You see that there's been growth in regulation across the world over the last 10 to 15 years, also given the growth in technological development. So we have over 152, I think it's almost 160 regulators now that are in the world. And in Africa, you have 93% of African countries have regulators. Excellent. So, but the problem is that a lot of these regulators were established because the World Bank said so, because we needed funding, because we said that the telecommunications reform had to happen in a certain order. So these, and we can debate what is an independent regulator and what the definition of independent is, but we have the institutions that exist and that are in place and that are regulating the sector. So we have the cut and paste regulators, we've drawn the boxes, we've got the policies, we've got the rules, but what I would argue is it doesn't mean anything unless we have inside the box. And this is why I'm saying we must start to think inside the box, unless we have governance, leadership, and most important, will. What I do is I work in a lot of countries to either help the public sector to set up regulatory regimes or to help the private sector to understand what the regulatory framework means. And often, and I think this room is full of more private sector than public sector people, so often what we say is we want the public sector to be filled with governance, leadership, and will. But just as important, the private sector has to recognize that these regulations are for them to comply with. And compliance is a real issue when people are trying to find ways outside of the box to implement their ideas. And this is what leads to corruption across the continent, which leads to bad governance. And this governance that I'm talking about is public and private sector governance. So we've got our box. We need good governance. We need good leadership. And above and beyond all, we need will. And in areas where that has existed, and that recipe inside the box has existed, we've seen a lot of development. Again, in the examples I'll give you, I'll take us to the ICT sector. Because this combination is what gives investors security. It's what makes you know that the license that you've got is worth the paper that it's written on. In many countries, I've been to places where you can't even audit a license because each license is in a different format, signed by a different minister who's no longer there, and who followed a rule, but the people who implement this governance, leadership, and will are just as important as the frameworks that have been put in place. So where it's put in place, we can get innovation. We can start to think outside the box. We can start to implement these ideas. So what I'm saying is I'm not against the outside the box ideas, but they need to be done within a context that is inside the box. And one of these examples of out-of-the-box thinking that has been enabled by in-the-box regulation and policy is prepaid. Prepaid African innovation, because we had to address problems or challenges of African markets and the fact that cash-based societies and no credit. So prepaid, which has now gone from just the mobile sector, because investors knew that if we exploit this license that we have in front of us, we have rights, we have 20 years to make as much money out of the piece of paper and the licenses that we've been given. We trust that this license will be honored. We trust that the framework is such that we can actually get a return on our investment, so we will find ways, creative ways, such as prepaid, to make sure we reach those markets. The SIM pill is another. If you didn't have stability in the ICT sector, if you didn't have stability in the medical sectors and regulations that enabled innovation and development, the SIM pill, which is a very interesting innovation where you saw that medical practitioners and innovators saw was that TB patients were not taking their medication regularly. So they put a SIM card inside a dispenser and they made it so that every time you open the SIM card, it sends a message to a server, and then records what time that message was sent. So every day, that time, for the next 6 months, when you have to take your TB medication, you're going to be able to, you'll be reminded, or your caregiver will also get an SMS. Great innovation, because people knew that they have guarantees that if they invest money in these kinds of things, they will get a return on it. Unfortunately, innovation from Africa, which isn't implemented in many African countries, it's actually used more for elderly and Alzheimer's patients in Europe, because the medical sector regulations don't allow for this, because you have to make sure that there's quality, you make sure that the SMSs won't be, they will be delivered, you can't rely on it. So again, regulation is important to make sure that innovation occurs. I won't go too much into mobile payments, but mobile payments were enabled because central banks realized that if they put in place regulatory frameworks to encourage people to invest in the mobile sector, not in the mobile sector, in the payment sector using technology, this would happen. Now this one is one where you can use regulation to protect innovation. This picture is taken in May this year, an invention by one of the companies. It was launched and it allows you to charge your phone while you're riding your bicycle for people who use bicycles as transportation. Someone invented this in Uganda years ago. This picture I got off the internet at least 5 years ago. But without copyright law, without patent law, without having the regulatory frameworks to make sure that this, and I'm not accusing any manufacturer of doing anything, but without making sure that these kinds of innovations are protected, then we won't be able to get the ideas, the creativity, the prosperity that we need in Africa. So I'm sure you've all seen this. I know the bell will ring just now. this thing where you have to connect the dots using 4 lines and find a way of doing it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't think outside of the box. I'm just saying that we need to recognize that there is a box. And in doing business in Africa, the opportunity also exists in the box. It's not because there's a lack of frameworks that we should go in and get, whether it's mining rights, telecoms rights, other rights, but rather that we should recognize these boxes. And it's just as important for the private sector to recognize and respect these boxes as it is to demand of the public sector that this should happen. So create boxes, make sure they're the right size, fill them with governance and leadership, and with that, then we'll be able to start the building blocks of building prosperity within the continent. Thank you.